Here's something we want to acknowledge up front. Wealth imbalance in second marriages is something we've seen play out in a lot of different ways, different careers, different earning histories, different circumstances. And what we've learned is that the gap itself isn't the problem. It's the silence around it that causes damage. The reason we're talking about it today is because the families we work with need permission to talk about it too.
That's what today is about.
The point is, wealth imbalance in second marriages is real. It's common, and it's something we've lived. Here's a pattern we see constantly in our practice. One spouse is worth $2 million, built a successful business, saved aggressively, has a strong retirement portfolio. The other spouse is worth $200,000, raised kids as a single parent after a divorce, didn't have the same earning power or time to build wealth. They're getting remarried. They're in love. They're worried about money, not because they don't trust each other, but because the wealth imbalance creates questions they don't yet know how to answer. Today, Jerry and I are going to walk you through exactly how to handle this with fairness, clarity, and love.
April, let's start with the question these couples often ask first. Is it fair to split expenses 50-50 when one spouse has significantly more wealth?
Should you split expenses 50-50 when one spouse has more money in a second marriage? Here's the answer. Probably not. Here's why 50-50 often doesn't work when there's a wealth imbalance. If one spouse has 2 million and the other has 200,000, a 50-50 split on a 6,000 monthly mortgage feels very different for each of them. For the wealthier spouse, $3,000 a month might be 2%. For the other, it might be 20% of their monthly income. That's not equitable. Here's what we might suggest. Split expenses based on income or wealth ratio, not 50-50. If one spouse's income is 300,000 and the other's is 75,000, that's an 80-20 split. The higher earner contributes 80% to shared expenses, the other contributes 20%. This way, you're both contributing proportionally. You both have similar financial breathing room left over. Now, some couples choose 50-50 anyway, because it feels simpler or because the lower wealth spouse wants to contribute equally. If that works for you both without creating resentment, that's fine. But in our experience, proportional contributions reportedly feel more fair in the long run when there is a significant wealth gap. So income-based or wealth-based split, not 50-50. That's, at least in practice, what we usually see works. Now that leads to the next big question these couples struggle with. Should the wealthier spouse help the less wealthy spouse catch up financially, or should wealth stay separate?
Should the wealthier spouse help the less wealthy spouse build wealth in a second marriage? This is a deeply personal question, and I can tell you from experience, it's one worth having explicitly before you get married, not after. Here's what we've seen work. Some couples keep wealth building completely separate. Each person manages their own investments, their own retirement accounts, their own financial future. Other couples build together. The wealthier spouse might fund both Roth IRAs or contribute more to joint investment accounts, specifically to help the less wealthy spouse build financial security. Here's the question you need to ask each other. What happens if the wealthier spouse dies first? Is the surviving spouse financially secure? If the answer is no, you need to address that through life insurance, through estate planning, through intentional wealth building together. This is where the financial and estate planning conversation can't be separated. You don't have to equalize wealth. The goal is to make sure both of you are financially secure, both in retirement and if one of you dies. Are you both protected? Are you both secure? That's the question. And that might mean keeping wealth separate with good estate planning, or it might mean building wealth together. But the goal is security, not equality. Should you consider a prenup when there's a significant wealth imbalance in a second marriage?
Should you consider a prenup when one spouse has significantly more wealth in a second marriage? Here's how we think about it. A prenup is a tool. And like any tool, whether it makes sense depends entirely on your individual circumstances, your assets, your kids, your family dynamics, and what you're trying to protect. What a prenup does is create explicit clarity where silence would otherwise leave gaps. It's not about distrust. It's about protecting kids from a previous marriage and making sure everyone's intentions are on paper. If the wealthier spouse dies without a prenup or a clear estate plan, their wealth could go entirely to the surviving spouse, and there's no legal requirement it will ever reach the kids from a first marriage. A prenup can address that directly. Here's what I'm bringing into this marriage, and here's what I want to make sure goes to my kids if I die. It can also work in the other direction, protecting the less wealthy spouse. A well structured prenup can spell out exactly how the surviving spouse will be provided for through life insurance, a trust, or ownership of a home, while still directing premarital assets to the intended beneficiaries. Here's what a thoughtful prenup might say. My premarital assets stay mine and go to my kids, but I'll provide for my spouse through life insurance, through income from a trust, or through ownership of our home. Everyone's intentions are clear. No ambiguity. If there's a wealth imbalance and you have kids from a previous marriage, a prenup is worth a conversation with both an estate planning attorney and a financial advisor who understands blended families. It's not right for every situation, but for many, it's simply a tool that creates clarity where there would otherwise be silence. Now, even without a prenup, there's another tool we want you to know about. How do you structure your estate plan to protect both your spouse and your kids when there's a wealth imbalance?
How do you structure an estate plan when one spouse has more wealth in a blended family? Here's the tool most people don't know about, and the one we wish more families discovered before they needed it: a Q-tip trust. A Q-tip, Qualified Terminal Interest Property Trust, is one of the most important planning tools for blended families with wealth imbalance. Here's how it works. When the wealthier spouse passes, their assets are placed into a trust that provides income and potentially additional support to the surviving spouse for life. But here's the key. When the surviving spouse passes, the remaining assets go to the original spouse's chosen beneficiaries, usually their children. It resolves one of the most painful tensions in blended family planning. I want to take care of my spouse, but I also need my kids to be protected. With a Q-tip trust, you don't have to choose, you provide for both. And here's something that often gets overlooked in these conversations. Determining what's fair for each child is rarely straightforward. Children from different marriages may be significantly different ages. A 30-year-old and a 12-year-old have very different financial needs. Some children may be expecting an inheritance from another source entirely. Others may already be financially independent. What looks equal on paper may not actually serve each child well. A thoughtful estate plan accounts for those individual circumstances, not just equal dollar amounts. You can also use life insurance to address the imbalance directly. If your estate is going to your kids, a life insurance policy can provide a lump sum to your spouse when you die, so they're not left financially vulnerable. The key point: a simple will does not solve wealth imbalance in a blended family. You need trusts, you need life insurance, and you need an estate attorney who understands blended family nuances. So Q-tip trusts, life insurance, and professional estate planning. That's how you protect everyone when there's a wealth gap. There's one more question we need to address, and it's a sensitive one. What if the wealthier spouse wants to maintain control over their wealth? Is that fair in a marriage?
Is it fair for the wealthier spouse to maintain control over their wealth in a second marriage? Here's the truth. It depends on how it's done. If the wealthier spouse is controlling, secretive, or using money as power in the relationship, that's not healthy. That's a form of financial control, and that's not okay. But if the wealthier spouse is transparent, provides for their spouse's needs, and simply wants to make sure their premarital wealth goes to their kids, that's reasonable. Here's the framework. The wealth you brought into the marriage can stay yours. The wealth you built together during the marriage could be shared. If one spouse had $2 million before the marriage, that can stay theirs, with the understanding that it will eventually go to their kids, but with provisions to take care of the surviving spouse. But if you build another $500,000 together during the marriage, that should be joint. That's partnership wealth. The wealthier spouse shouldn't hoard money or make the less wealthy spouse feel financially dependent. And the less wealthy spouse shouldn't expect to inherit wealth that was always intended for the other spouse's kids. So yes, the wealthier spouse can maintain control over premarital assets as long as they're providing for their spouse's security and being transparent about their estate plan.
And finally, there's one thing couples with wealth imbalance need to think about. How do you talk about wealth imbalance without creating shame or resentment?
How do you talk about wealth imbalance in a second marriage without creating shame? Here's what we tell couples: lead with empathy and acknowledge the reality. The less wealthy spouse shouldn't feel ashamed. Building wealth isn't just about hard work, it's about opportunity, timing, career choices, and sometimes just luck. If she spent 15 years raising kids as a single mom, she may not have had the same opportunity to build wealth. It's not a moral failing, that's reality. And the wealthier spouse shouldn't feel guilty. If the wealthier spouse built a business and saved aggressively, that's something to be proud of. He's not obligated to give away what he worked for. Here's the conversation. I have more wealth than you do. That's a reality. But I want to make sure you're financially secure, both now and if I die first. Let's talk about how we want to do that. And the less wealthy spouse can say, I'm not expecting to inherit wealth meant for your kids, but I do need to know I'm protected if something happens to you. That's the conversation. No shame, no guilt, just honest acknowledgement of reality and a commitment to protect each other. Wealth imbalance doesn't doom a second marriage, but avoiding the conversation about it absolutely can. So talk about it early, talk about it honestly, talk about it often, and make a plan. Then revisit the plan, because life changes and the plan should too.
So just to recap, if one spouse has significantly more wealth in a second marriage, here's what you need to do.
Split expenses based on income or wealth ratio, not always 50-50.
Decide whether you're building wealth together or keeping it separate, but make sure both spouses are financially secure.
Consider whether a prenup makes sense for your situation, especially if you have kids from a previous marriage. It's one tool among several worth discussing with your estate planning attorney.
Use tools like Q-tip trusts and life insurance to protect both your spouse and your kids. This is where a financial advisor and estate attorney working together makes the biggest difference.
The wealthier spouse can maintain control over premarital assets as long as they're providing for their spouse's security.
And talk about the wealth imbalance openly. No shame, no guilt, just honest planning.
And if it helps, even your financial advisor navigated this. Some of us are still navigating it.
Wealth imbalance is common in second marriages. With the right plan in place, it doesn't have to be a source of conflict.